Good morning. Thank you for your invitation. So, in this talk today, I will explore what we did in our research group to deal with information spreading on online social media, and especially about polarization issues. And of course, we also studied then the misinformation problem. I will start by giving a bit of context of the digital information space in which we are operating. And I would like to start by this picture here that shows the data that we produce every 60 seconds on using online digital platforms. And you can see here the difference between, for example, the 2017 and 2018. The idea behind these pictures is that disinformation is growing. We are always relying on our digital devices to access information and also to produce information. And so we are in this hyper-connected space where it's very easy to communicate with people all around the world, and we also have lots of information we have to deal with. So in this context, the two first characteristics are the hyperconnectivity and the data deluge, or the information overload that we have to deal with. And the second important characteristic is that this new context is different from the old one, the traditional one. If we think at the television, the print, or the radio, because this new context is disintermediated. This means that there is no mediation between the creation of contents and reaching the public. I mean that when information was just spread by television or by the press, that information was first mediated, for example, by journalists or by experts before reaching the public. This is no longer true, or at least is partially true, because as users we not only can access information on the internet, but we can also produce our own information. So we have an active role in information production and consumption. And this is the other important characteristic of this new information space. So why these characteristics are important? Because we are in this new context. We have lots of information we have to deal with. We also have lots of heterogeneous information sources that we can access to. The problem is that we as human beings have limited attention, and so usually we want to, and we have to deal with this information very quickly and very rapidly. And so this sometimes can cause some side effects, and these side effects are mainly what we can call as mental traps. So we use some heuristics, we use some shortcuts to interpret reality rapidly, and so to act to the reality and to the information. And so this cognitive shortcuts that we apply and are many, and one of the most important information consumption and information spreading on online social media is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is that cognitive bias that is our tendency to look for information that is confirming what we already believe. So to look for information that is coherent with our system of beliefs, and in other words, to look for information that we like. And we not only look for information that we like, but we also interpret information in this way, and in this way we keep reinforcing our idea. We will see that confirmation bias has a very crucial role in how we deal with information. And in this sense, I would also like to talk very quickly about some other cognitive phenomenon. For example, that of the mechanism of group polarization. This mechanism is so happens when we discuss with like-minded people, so people that have very similar opinion to us, and in the end we reinforce our original views and end up in a more extreme opinion than the one where we started. And we will see that this mechanism can be also observed on, for example, on social media. And in this regard, it's interesting to talk about the Asch experiment. This is a very old and famous experiment of 1955, and in the experiment there were 8 participants. Indeed, the subject of the experiment was one, and all the participants were asked to match the line on the left card to the corresponding line on the right card. So this seems to be a quite simple task, and there were 3 rounds, and in each round the participants had to match the lines. So in the first round all the participants gave the correct answer, and subject of course could decide. And in the second and third round some of the participants started giving the wrong answer, and the subject could decide to keep her own decision or to change it. So what's interesting in this experiment is that while in the first round the error rate was less than 1%, in the second and in third rounds, so where other people in the group were giving the wrong answer, these error rates grows to 37%. So this means that when we are under group pressure, we can also abandon this, our own senses, what our own senses are telling us, to reach the consensus and to listen to the others. So this mechanism have a role in how we deal with information and how we interpret information online. And what we did as a research group was to try to apply a new approach to study this phenomenon. So the idea was to answer questions coming from the social sciences. So for example, what's the role of confirmation bias in information consumption and information spreading online? But we wanted to do this in a quantitative way by using the data that are available online, that the data that we as users leave on, for example, on social media, when we leave our likes, our comments, or we share content. And so this we applied these quantitative methods coming from the mathematics, the statistics, and computer sciences to answer these questions. And what I'm doing now is to sort of a really quick summary of our results, because we've been working on this for a lot now. And so the first result is that we measured and provided the empirical existence of echo chambers. What are echo chambers? Are these groups of polarized users, of like-minded users, who keep reinforcing their opinions inside the groups, and these chambers are pretty separated, well separated from one another. So this means that once you are inside your echo chamber, you're just tending to ignore everything that is outside your echo chamber. So in other words, you're ignoring information that is contrasting to your system of beliefs, and also information that is contrasting in general to your narrative, to your preferred narrative. So in this picture here, I'm showing the 2 echo chambers that we could observe on the Italian Facebook for the scientific and the pseudoscientific communities. And you can see that the majority of dots, so each dot is a user and is colored, so if the user is polarized towards a community or the other, you can see that there are mainly 2 communities, the red and the blue, and there is almost nothing between these 2 echo chambers. So our next question was to understand what was the behavior of users inside these chambers and between these chambers. And what we observed by looking at the sentiment of users, so how users were expressing their opinions on the social media, was that indeed inside the echo chambers we were observing a degeneration of the discussion when the discussion became longer. But this and this was happening inside the echo chambers, so where you discuss with people that have similar opinion to your own. So our question was, what's happened when when different communities, contrasting communities meet together and discuss? So what we wanted to analyze was, if I have a user from the scientific echo chamber that is discussing with a user from the pseudoscientific echo chamber, what's happening between them? So this discussion a civil debate or not? And what we observed, and you can look here, is that once the comments of a post, so the discussion is becoming longer in the post, the sentiment is going towards negative values. So it seemed that users from different echo chambers were discussing in a very negative way. And also the other interesting fact was that these meetings were very rare, so were not happening very often. We had less than 8,000 posts where this was happening over more than 300,000 posts. So this was that was a clash between tribes, okay? And what we wanted to analyze and understand next, okay, so if these users coming from different and opposing narratives, when discussing together, are just very negative, and so the discussion does not appear to be really good. So what's happening when you try to correct information, so to change their mind in some sense? And what we did was to analyze the effect of debunking campaigns, so all those campaigns that on Facebook, for example, are done to correct false information, or to correct hoaxes. And so what we did was to first analyze who were the users interacting with this content, and we observed that the majority of users came from the scientific echo chamber. So the main consumer of debunking information, or fact-checking information, was coming from the scientific echo chamber, and in principle did not need the debunking. But very few users from the conspiracy echo chamber, so from also the pseudo-scientific, we could say, echo chamber, were interacting with this content. Very few users, because we had less than 300,000 users over more than 9 million users. So, but for these users, our question was, so is this working? At least for these few users, is debunking working? How we measured this? We looked at how these users were interacting with pseudo-scientific content before and after the interaction. So we expect these users to decrease their activity inside the pseudo-scientific echo chamber if the debunking is working. And what we can observe here is that indeed, and this activity was reinforced and increased after the interaction with debunking. So debunking was not only not working, but was also not effective at all, and acted as a backfire effect, so reinforced the original opinions of the users. So well, with this study, for example, the Washington Post then decided to close their weekly column on fact-checking and debunking, because the journalists also said that it started to feel a little pointless. So, but what we did next was to, so our idea was to understand if this mechanism can be applied only in the case of pseudoscientific claims, or more in general misinformation, or this is generally true if we talk about other topics. So we did this, for example, for the Brexit, so for political topics, and what we observed is that we again have two main echo chambers, one for each, so one community that is just interacting with information coming from this category of sources, and the red community from the other category of sources. So even in the case of Brexit, the users were really polarized, and we observed two well separated and segregated communities, and you can observe the polarization even there when we can observe the two main peaks on the two extremes of the graph. And this is not true just for political issues, it's true when we talk about vaccines, it's true when we talk about climate change. So wherever we have a controversial topic, what we can observe is that we have a stronger polarization of users about this topic. But so after this, our question was, so this is happening for very controversial topics and for very specific topics. So what happens in general if I consider all the information that I can access on the internet? What's happening? So are we in this way, or it's just a matter of controversial topics? And the answer is that unfortunately we are in this way. So we want to interact with information that we like. We polarized towards information, and these graphs are just showing here that if we look at how we interact with all the news outlets that are available on Facebook in English language, so in this case we had more than 376 million users, what we observed is that even here we have 5 main echo chambers, and we are just interacting with information coming from a single echo chamber. And what we also observed was that this number of information sources we are interacting with is decreasing when our activity and our lifetime on the platform is increasing. So the more we are active and the more we are, I can say, alive on the platform, the less is the number of pages, so of information sources I am interacting with. So, and this is what here we measured indeed the selective exposure. So we have the problem that potentially the internet could offer us lots of information and a huge variety of information. The problem is that us as human beings tend to confine our attention to a very limited group or category of information sources, and to limit our attention to these information sources. So what we can do, so what we observed is that it seems that the main problem here is the polarization issue. So if we are polarized and this mechanism allows us to just confine inside the echo chambers, the problem is that these echo chambers are not communicating with one another, and so it's very difficult to break them. What we are doing is to try to find some ways to smooth this polarization and to improve the debate online. So in this sense, first work was about the early warning of potential misinformation targets. So our idea was this: since the problem seems to be in polarization, and since debunking is not working, and what we also observed is that once a topic appears on official news, in less than 24 hours this topic will be covered by fake news. So we have very few time to counteract. But if I'm able to tell in advance what topics can be covered by fake news, I can alert, for example, the communicators or journalists to tell them, okay, be careful, this topic is very sensitive, can be subject of fake news in the very short time, and so you can change your communication strategy, maybe to try to smooth polarization around this topic. We did this with this framework. I wouldn't go here in the technical details, but the interesting idea behind this is that we exploit some features attached to the data that are really features that depend on how users are interacting with content. So not on the type of content, but how users are interacting with this content. And by looking at this, at how this content is presented, how users are interacting in terms of sentiment, and a series of metrics that we defined, we were are able to tell if a particular topic will be subject to fake news in the short time. And so that's why we call this the early warning. But the idea is that, so imagine that we can use a system like this when I know that a specific topic has to be deal with in a different way, or because it's sensitive. So the idea is, so what's the best communication strategy to deal with the topic? And this is what we are doing now. I will show you very briefly two projects. This one is just finished and was a project in collaboration with the London School of Economics and Corriere della Sera, which is the main newspaper that we have in Italy. And the idea was to work together also with journalists to analyze data from Facebook and Twitter to monitor how readers were reacting to information about the migration issue, which is a very controversial topic in Italy. The idea of the project was to try to find a communication strategy that was able to improve trust with respect to communication source, in this case the Corriere, and to smooth polarization and to promote the civil debate. What we did was to, and also why we chose migration, because of course it was very controversial when we started, and also because it's, for example, really interesting that we didn't have really an emergency in Italy about migration, so that we observed a decrease in new arrivals, and this decrease was certified by the Ministry of Interiors. But if we look at the data, so at how this topic was covered by information sources in Italy, we can see that while migration was reducing, indeed the content about migration was increasing. So you can see here that all this content about migration is increasing starting from 2017 towards 2018. And when we looked at how users were interacting with this content, we also observed that this content was much more engaging than other content on Facebook. So for example, on the Corriere Facebook page, if you look here at the red content, which is the migration content, you can observe that it gets much more likes, comments and shares than the gray line, which is the other topics on the page. So the topic was also pretty engaging. So what we did, and what we also observed, and this is quite interesting, was that when we looked at echo chambers around migration in Italy, what we observed before June 2018, so March-May 2018, was that we had three main communities: the mainstream media, we can say, the right-wing media, and the five-star movement. So three main communities about the topic. After June 2018, and June 2018 is when we had the coalition government between Lega and Five Star Movement, we can observe just two communities. So we had the mainstream media community and the alternative media that was indeed including both the right wing and the Five Star Movement. So why? Because around the topic, the narrative was now pretty similar, and so for confirmation bias, those users were just interacting with information coming from different sources. This was quite interesting because in general these echo chambers are pretty stable in time, and in this case we observed this, and this was then stable towards the government. So what we did in the experiment was to, so the Corriere published some stories about migration. We didn't decide the content, so journalists were free to choose the content based on the current news. But what they did was to try a variety of content types and journalistic technique to cover the news. And so they published on their Facebook page 114 news stories. And what we did was to track their engagement online in terms of likes, comments, and shares, to analyze the sentiment of users involved in the discussion, and to annotate manually more than 26,000 comments to assign 3 labels: the toxic label, label the mistrust and the position on migration. So the toxic label was helpful to understand how aggressive was the content of the comment, and if the content was, for example, disrespectful, if it was a comment that lets you abandon a conversation. The mistrust of Corriere was a label to understand if the comment was against the source, so we use this as a proxy of trust with respect to the source, and the position of migration if the comment was against or in favor of migration. And what we have as main insights is that, for example, when we have multimedia pieces, so lots of images or videos, these pieces are getting a strong engagement and low levels of criticism of media. When we use the facts, we push facts, for example, in infographics, or we use data, we have a significant pushback from anti-migration voices and high criticism of the media. So the Corriere was criticized because maybe it was just showing some data, so a part of data, and hiding something else. And for example, the videos is the category, the content type that got the lowest level of criticism of media. In terms of techniques, what we observed is that usually the straightforward, impartial article is the one that seems to elicit the most trust in user. When we use human interest stories, so stories that were covering the migration issue by addressing, for example, the story of a particular migrant or a group of migrants, this got a high number of anti-migration comments, many toxic comments, and a lot of media criticism. And in general, any type of strong opinion or policy proposal, so for example, constructive news or editorials, elicit a lot of criticism in the media source and lots of anti-migration commenters. So in this case, this seems that this is not really working to smooth polarization around the topic, and this is also true in general for a data-driven approach. So this is confirming what we observed about, in general, debunking and pushing facts to try to change users' mind on the subject. And in this direction, so to understand what are the best communication strategies to talk about, in general, to talk about controversial issues or more in general scientific issues, what we have is what we are doing is the Quest project, which is a 2 years European H 2020 project, and here we are covering. So we are analyzing quality and effectiveness of science communication, and we are evaluating science communication on 3 strands: journalism, social media, and museums, and we are doing this working together with stakeholders. And for what concerns the information, so science communication on social media, what we are doing is that we are collected lots of information about science communication accounts that are active on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We are analyzing this information, and we are covering the different 7 countries in Europe, and we are also covering 3 specific and controversial topics that are the vaccines, artificial intelligence, and climate change. So the idea is that once we have defined a common definition what can constitute quality and effective science communication, we can also derive some key performance indicators of this quality and this effectiveness, and we can derive guidelines to improve science communication on social media. But the idea of the project is that in the experimental phase, so next year of the project, we will test these guidelines online to evaluate these guidelines, see if these guidelines can work with communicators or people that are applying them, and to possibly refine these guidelines. So I am done. This is a list of publications that is maybe related to what I told this morning. Thank you for your attention.